Hello, everyone. Today we're going to keep talking about FDR and the Second New Deal. Now, last time we kind of talked about how FDR received some criticism from his left. People such as Francis Townsend, Huey Long, and Father Charles Coughlin didn't think the New Deal went far enough. So as the election of 1936 approaches, FDR starts to move more towards the left. Some historians think he did this just to steal the thunder from these men and these programs. But actually, FDR had been pushing for a lot of these reforms that he's going to push for right before the 1936 election. In January of 1934, in a special message to Congress, he laid out kind of the path his Second New Deal would take. He said that in the old America, the America of the family farm and the frontier, security came from the family and from the community. But now in the America of the industrial age, family and community could no longer provide security. Security would have to come from the nation, meaning the government. Security would be the main theme of the Second New Deal, and really the whole New Deal itself. If you want to think of one word that describes the New Deal, probably security is the word. Now, FDR said that every American had three rights: the right to a decent house to live in, the right to productive work, and security against the hazards and vicissitudes of life. So security against the ups and downs of life. So those are kind of the principles that guides his Second New Deal. In April 1935, something called the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act was passed. This is the largest peacetime appropriations bill to date in American history. It authorized $4 billion in new spending and almost a billion more in reallocated funds from previous appropriations. Now, these appropriations are to be spent on work relief and public work constructions. FDR wanted to get away from just handing money out through direct relief. He saw this as degrading. He said, quote, "The federal government must and shall quit this business of relief." He basically went on later to say that handing out money kind of created a spiritual and moral disintegration, fundamentally destructive to the national fiber. He said, to dole out relief in this way is to administer a narcotic, a subtle destroyer of the human spirit. So we're going to get away from direct relief and we're going to get more into the realm of public works and work relief. Now, the largest agency born out of that Appropriations Act was the Works Progress Administration. It was created by an executive order and it was headed by Harry Hopkins. Over the 8 years of its life, the WPA employed 8.5 million people. It cost $11 billion to implement. And basically, the WPA just put people to work building. They built 500,000 miles of highways, hundreds of thousands of bridges, 100,000 public buildings, the Dock Street Theater in Charleston, Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood in Oregon. They built schools, roads, courthouses, hospitals. They built the Triborough Bridge, the Lincoln Tunnel, LaGuardia Airport. They built the Skyline Drive in Virginia, the Overseas Highway in the Florida Keys. They built the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridges. They also built the aircraft carriers Yorktown and Enterprise. They'll be important later on in World War II. Now, there was a proviso attached to this appropriations bill by the isolationist Senator William E. Borah of Idaho that said no money could be spent for munitions, warships, or military or naval material. But some of that spending is from the previous appropriations already allocated, so they kind of get around it in a certain way. The WPA also supported the arts. Speaking of artists, Harry Hopkins said, quote, "Hell, they've got to eat just like other people." So there was a federal art project that employed painters and sculptors to teach their crafts in rural schools. They commissioned muralists to paint scenes on post office walls throughout America. There was the Federal Music Project, which sponsored dozens of symphony orchestras and jazz groups. 15,000 Americans gave some, 250,000 music performances throughout the Great Depression. There was the Federal Theater Project, which performed plays throughout the country. They put on free plays in Central Park. The most famous, though, is probably the Federal Writers Project. They wrote something called the American Guide series. It was basically a set of guidebooks to each of the states, major cities, and highways. Writers also interviewed former slaves and wrote down their stories. So you have a lot of of people around that remember what slavery was like, and they're starting to get old and die off. So the Federal Writers Project starts to catalog these stories. So it's pretty interesting. Now, there was a lot of criticism of the WPA. Some of it's based on the fear that too much power is in the president or the government's hands to kind of spend money. Some is based on the fear of corruption, and some is just based on, hey, this is a government program that's going to be inefficient. The journalist Walter Lippmann wrote, quote, "The most powerful criticism against the work relief bill is that it permits the president to spend nearly $5 billion at his discretion. WPA money was often used to buy votes for the Democrats. Democrats in various parts of the country required WPA workers to tithe a portion of their WPA checks to the Democrat Party." So there's all kinds of stories about this going on. The economic historian Gavin Wright found that WPA employment reached its peaks in the fall of election years. So right before an election, the Democrats would kind of start spending more money so that the economy would be better, people would have a job, and they would tend to vote Democrat. The economists Jim Couch and William Shugart, they studied spending patterns in many New Deal programs, including the WPA. In their book, The Political Economy of the New Deal, they found that, quote, "Political self-interest was perhaps the most important motive underlying the administration's spending decisions. A state's popular vote support for FDR in the 1932 presidential election and its importance to the president's electoral college strategy are consistently significant determinants of the amount of federal aid it received." So basically, poor states like the South received the least amount of federal relief money because they were solidly Democrat. They were going to vote for the Democrats no matter what because of segregation and racial issues. So FDR didn't really need to spend money there to kind of win votes. He already had those votes. Other people criticized the WPA. Its nickname was "We Piddle Around." That also spells WPA. So many of the jobs were make-work projects. The term boondoggle starts to come into use to describe WPA projects. The reporter Frank Kent wrote about talking to a congressman who discovered, quote, 7 men in an automobile going around his district counting caterpillars, not the machinery, the animal. So there's lots of stories of just waste with the WPA. But, you know, if you kind of travel around America today, you can see schools or high school football stadiums or, you know, roads that were built by the WPA. So there's kind of two arguments to it. That Appropriations Act also creates the Rural Electrification Administration. They bring electricity to farmers and people in the rural parts of America. It also creates the National Youth Administration, which helps give part-time jobs to high schoolers and college students. It also creates the Resettlement Administration. They built greenbelt suburban towns and experimented in urban planning. So lots of things are going on. Another big law that gets passed in 1935 is the National Labor Relations Act. It's also called the Wagner Act. It kind of created a skeletal framework to protect workers' rights to organize. It required employees to agree to bargain. It empowered the National Labor Relations Board to do the following: protect workers from coercion, supervise union elections, engage in collective bargaining, and it prohibited discrimination against union members. It prohibited management from refusing to bargain, and it prohibited management sponsorship of company unions. So it's basically trying to create an environment where workers can organize. However, after management meets with the union and talks about labor's demands, management doesn't have to go along with anything. They can still say, nope, we don't want to do what you ask us to do. Now, the most important piece of the entire New Deal, the second New Deal, and probably the whole New Deal, was the Social Security Act. This was signed into law in August of 1935. In Freedom from Fear, David Kennedy writes, quote, "No other New Deal measure proved more lastingly consequential or more emblematic of the very meaning of the New Deal. The Social Security Act provided unemployment insurance and old age pensions. In mid-1934, FDR's Labor Secretary, Frances Perkins, she chaired a cabinet meeting where they start to prepare Social Security legislation. Then she convened something called the Committee on Economic Security, and these are experts that start to hash out the details. Basically, the unemployment insurance was financed by a tax on employers of 8 or more people. The old age pensions were financed by a mandatory contribution from workers and their employers. FDR wanted the Social Security Act's money to come from people paying into the system. That way you could never get rid of it later on. He said about this, quote, "With those taxes in there, no damn politician can ever scrap my Social Security program." The Social Security Act laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state. Now, it did exclude some 9.4 million farm laborers, domestic servants, and workers in establishments with fewer than 10 employees. But it did offer security against, the vicissitudes of life to some 26 million workers. So the Social Security Act doesn't cover all Americans. It only covers about 26 million workers. Later on, when we get to the Great Society and Lyndon Johnson, we'll talk about how Social Security gets expanded. Now, the first American to receive a Social Security check was Ida M. Fuller. She received her first check on January 17, 1940, and it was for $41.30. FDR also pushed through some other laws in 1935. He pushed through the Banking Act of 1935. And then he pushed through something called the wealth tax. He basically raised taxes and tried to go after rich people's money. William Randolph Hearst began to refer to the wealth tax as, quote, "soak the successful tax." So basically, this was maybe the one measure FDR really pursued in order to kind of steal the thunder from people like Huey Long. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit more coming up, but just as FDR is passing the most important New Deal legislation in 1935, the Supreme Court is striking down most of his most important previous New Deal measures. So in May, they strike down the Railroad Retirement Act and the National Industrial Recovery Act. That's the big one. In January 1936, they strike down the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So the Supreme Court's knocking down a lot of New Deal laws, and FDR is worried that things like the Wagner Act and Social Security, which are being challenged, he's worried that in 1937 they're going to get tossed out as unconstitutional. Now, FDR is re-nominated for the Democrat nomination in 1936. He speaks at Franklin Field in Philadelphia to kind of accept the nomination. As he's going up to the podium, this is one of the only times he falls down in public. Now, if you were up in the stands, you couldn't see him, but everyone around him saw him fall. They kind of gather around him and hide it, but he did fall. It's kind of a embarrassing moment for him. But at this speech in Philadelphia, he attacks the economic royalists. He says, quote, "A small group had concentrated into their own hands an almost complete control over other people's property, other people's money, other people's labor, other people's lives." FDR really talks about how he believes the government is the solution. He said, quote, "Governments can err. Presidents do make mistakes, but the immortal Dante tells us that divine justice weighs the sins of the cold-blooded and the sins of the warm-hearted in different scales." So basically, FDR believes that business and government can make mistakes, but since the government has good intentions, it's not as big of a deal as business who have bad intentions. He ends up talking about, he says, quote, "Better the occasional faults of a government that lives in a spirit of charity than the consistent omission of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference." Then came the most famous part of his acceptance speech. He says, quote, "There is a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations much is given, of other generations much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny," and that's true because World War II is coming up and they'll become the greatest generation. Now, in the 1936, Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas, was nominated by the Republicans. Some people call Alf Landon the Kansas Coolidge, but Landon is actually a progressive Republican and he agrees with most of the New Deal. There's a new political party that opposes FDR, the Union Party. It's created in June of 1936. The supporters of the Townsend Plan, Father Charles Coughlin, and Huey Long's self-appointed successor, Gerald L.K. Smith, they pour their support into the new party. Huey Long was assassinated in September of 1935. It may have been that he was killed by one of his mistress's husbands. We don't really know exactly why he was killed because the police that were there when he was assassinated killed his assassin right away. FDR wins in a huge landslide. He wins 28 million votes. Alf Landon wins 16 million. FDR wins 523 electoral votes, and Landon only wins 8. He wins, I believe, Maine and Vermont. Those are the only 2 states. The Democrats have over a 3-to-1 majority in the House, and they control 76 seats in the Senate. William Allen White said of FDR, quote, "He has all but been crowned by the people." Okay, so a lot of historians have kind of wondered, how did FDR win in such a huge margin? You know, the Great Depression is still going on. Nothing's been solved, really. The historian William Leuchtenberg, who is kind of pro-FDR, he likes FDR a lot. He said in 1936 that the 1936 election was, quote, "very much in doubt." So there's a few explanations for why FDR won such a big landslide, and these explanations might all be true kind of together. You know, FDR did have a policy of using the federal government to attack the Great Depression. This inspired a lot of people who wanted something to be done. You know, maybe his programs weren't working, but at least he was trying something. You know, FDR created a whole new Democrat coalition. Millions of laborers in northern industrial cities who had not previously voted did so for FDR and the Democrats in 1936. Because FDR had given them support for labor's right to bargain collectively. FDR appointed a lot of Catholics as judges, so he kind of gets the Catholic vote. A majority of blacks for the first time since 1856 vote for the Democrat Party. You know, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, the party that ended slavery and fought against segregation. This changed in 1936, not that they became a different party, but that blacks voted for the Democrats instead of the Republicans. So from 1856 to 1936, blacks voted for Republicans where they could, but this changes in 1936. FDR was not a civil rights crusader. He opposed federal anti-lynching laws, while most Republicans supported laws against lynching. But he did this because he didn't want to alienate the Democrats in the South. But Eleanor Roosevelt strongly supported civil rights. She goes out in public and does things that push for civil rights. And because FDR gave a lot of people jobs, that's why blacks start to vote for him in 1936, not because he changes his position on the civil rights. Some other reasons, FDR he was charismatic and he had a connection with the American people. Remember, he does fireside chats. People feel that FDR cares about them. You know, people would often say, FDR gave me a job. Another reason is FDR may have won by patronage, by WPA money being spent, stuff like that. There is some evidence that he put more people on federal relief, work relief when the election came up, and then after the election, maybe take them off. So there's some evidence of that. Like I said earlier, some Democrats use WPA money to take some of that out of people's paychecks and give it to the Democrat Party. Norman Thomas, he was a socialist. He said, quote, "The strength of the Democrat support is not based on particular satisfaction with the New Deal or confidence in it, but simply on the fact that the federal government is administering a great quantity of relief money, and that in some cases that administration is politically shrewder than it is socially wise." So you know it's bad when a socialist is criticizing you for spending too much money. Carter Glass, he's a Democrat senator from Virginia. He said, quote, "The election would have been much closer had my party not had $4,800,000,000 relief bill as campaign fodder." So that money that was previously passed, the Democrats use that to kind of win elections. The corruption with the WPA and using federal money to support the Democrat Party, it gets so bad that Congress passes the Political Activity Act in 1939. This is also known as the Hatch Act. It prohibits federal employees of the District of Columbia, state and local employees who administer federal programs from trying to influence the outcome of a political campaign or to offer jobs to a political campaign worker, or to manage a political campaign. Basically, it prohibits the influencing of politics through relief. FDR also used the IRS to kind of bully his political enemies. His son, Elliot Roosevelt, said, quote, "My father may have been the originator of the concept of employing the IRS as a weapon of political retribution." FDR goes after Huey Long, William Randolph Hearst, Father Charles Coughlin, Hamilton Fish. He's a Republican congressman from FDR's home district in New York. FDR wiretaps people. He has people go through their mail. So Burton Folsom's New Deal or Raw Deal has a whole chapter kind of just about how the IRS is used as a political tool to kind of help FDR politically. The Attorney General, Robert Jackson, he had a comment about FDR. He said, quote, "The president had a tendency to think in terms of right and wrong instead of terms of legal and illegal. He found difficulty in thinking that there could be legal limitations on them, meaning his actions." So FDR kind of thinks, I want what's best for people, and I have the power of the government at my disposal, so why can't I use it? I'm not going to abuse it. Now, FDR's second term, he starts to face more problems. We're going to talk about four things: the strikes of 1937, the court packing plan, his primary purge, and then the Roosevelt recession. Now, in 1937, there's a huge series of strikes that go on. With the passage of the Wagner National Labor Relations Act, the stage is set for labor to start forming unions. Now, there were basically two schools of thought in American labor. One was kind of the American Federation of Labor's idea that we only organize skilled workers. We don't care about unskilled workers. Well, a lot of people start to think in 1935 and sooner, but it kind of culminates in 1935, 36, 37. We should organize all the workers in an industry, so not just the skilled worker, but also the unskilled worker. John L. Lewis is probably the foremost supporter of organizing all the workers, skilled and unskilled, in an industry. Lewis creates something called the Committee for Industrial Organization. They're formed in November of 1935. Basically, they want to do that. They want to organize everybody in an industry. So all the steel workers belong to the same union. All the car manufacturers' workers belong to the same union. Well, what ends up happening is the CIO wants to start going after steel, but the first big strikes happen at GM in the car industry. GM is the world's largest manufacturing corporation. They employ over 250,000 people. With the economy improving, the car manufacturers are planning to produce a lot more cars in 1937. And what ends up happening is workers at the GM plant in Flint, Michigan, they stage a sit-down strike for 44 days from December 30th, 1936 until February 11th, 1937. So this is the Flint, Michigan sit-down strike. Basically, the workers said, what's the one critical point that if we sabotage that area, no cars can be produced? So they found that at the Flint Body Plant number 1 in Flint, Michigan, that's where they had the dyes that would be used to color the cars that GM was going to make for 1937. If that part of the plant gets shut down, if that part of production gets shut down, then they can't make any cars. So in December 1936, the strike begins. The workers refuse to work. They don't picket the factory. They don't go outside. They sit down in the plant and don't move. So they don't let any new workers come in. Previously, you would get fired and management would hire new people to come in and work for you. This time that doesn't happen. They refuse to leave the plant. In December 1936, GM produced 50,000 cars. In February 1937, they produced 125. So basically, production just nosedives. GM asked the government to step in, like, hey, these people are on private property and they refuse to leave. But Governor Frank Murphy of Michigan, he refuses to send the National Guard in to break the strike. He said, quote, "I'm not going down in history as Bloody Murphy." He did, however, provide state relief payments to the families of the strikers so they could keep striking. So, previous strikes in American history, the government would send in troops to break up the strike, or like with Teddy Roosevelt, he would talk with both sides and try to come with an agreement. Now the government basically is supporting the strikers and turning a deaf ear to management's cries. Under all this pressure, GM ends up caving. After 44 days, they agree to recognize the United Auto Workers as the sole representative of its workers. So basically, the car industry unionizes. Soon after, U.S. Steel, the biggest steel corporation in the world, they cave as well. They do this in March 1937. They announced that they would recognize the Steelworkers Organizing Committee as the representative of its workers. They increase the pay of their steel workers. They establish an 8-hour day, a 40-hour work week. They have time and a half overtime. So as a result, union membership rises dramatically. In 1933, there were about 3 million union members. But by the end of the 1930s, there's over 8 million union members, and that's going to continue to go up. Some other people did kind of hold out. Little Steel, some of the smaller steel companies, they held out. Eventually, the Supreme Court rules that the sit-down strike is unconstitutional. You can't just sit down on your job and refuse to leave. So here's kind of a quote to sum up things from David Kennedy's Freedom from Fear. He sums up the 1930s labor movement this way. Quote, just as workers eschewed the overthrow of capitalism to embrace bread and butter unionism, so did they repudiate radical politics and attach themselves to one of the existing mainstream parties. In the process, they wrote the epitaph for American socialism and stifled American communism in its cradle. So basically, a lot of people are worried during the Great Depression that socialism and communism is really going to spread and take off. But because labor is allowed to organize, they basically join the Democrat Party, so they decide to be moderate instead of radical. Now, another thing that kind of ends up happening is FDR goes after the Supreme Court. Now, remember this, in 1935, the Supreme Court struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act. In 1936, they struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act. They strike down some other laws later on. In March 1936, they strike down a New York minimum wage law. So basically, 1935, 1936, the Supreme Court strikes down a lot of FDR's New Deal legislation and other progressive legislation. And then FDR goes on to win a landslide in 1936. Well, in 1937, the Wagner Act is up, Social Security Act is before the Supreme Court. It's almost as if FDR wins one of the biggest landslides in history, and now the Supreme Court is just going to destroy everything he's done in 1935. The Supreme Court was made up of 3 liberal judges, 4 conservative judges, and then 2 moderate or swing voters. And FDR up to this point has not appointed a single justice to the Supreme Court. So what ends up happening is he decides to go after the Supreme Court. This is called his court packing scheme, or his court packing plan. On February 5th, 1937, he sends a special message to Congress. He outlines his plan. Basically what FDR does is he says, for every justice on the Supreme Court that does not retire at age 70, I want to be able to appoint another Supreme Court justice. He also wants to appoint some people to the lower federal courts. FDR argues, look, these justices on the Supreme Court are getting old. The work is backing up. They can't get things done. I need to appoint more people to the court. But Americans of all parties react with suspicion and outrage. They see this as an attack on the independency of the Supreme Court. Columnist Dorothy Thompson writes, quote, if the American people accept this last audacity of the president without letting out a yell to high heaven, they have ceased to be jealous of their liberties and are ripe for ruin. Democrat Representative Samuel B. Pettingill of Indiana said, quote, a packed jury, a packed court, and a stuffed ballot box are all on the same moral plane. This is more power than a good man should want or a bad man should have. Montana Senator Burton Wheeler, he spoke these words in a radio address, quote, create now a political court to echo the ideas of the executive, and you have created a weapon. a weapon which in the hands of another president could cut down those guarantees of liberty written by the blood of your fathers, or your forefathers. Senator Wheeler also produced a letter from the Chief Justice Charles Evan Hughes that successfully rebutted FDR's claim that the court was falling behind on its work. The court was actually keeping up with its work. FDR keeps pushing on his plan, but eventually the court packing scheme fails. Many Democrats within his own party oppose him. The letter from Charles Evan Hughes really turns a lot of people against FDR. But probably the most important factor is all of a sudden, in 1937, the Supreme Court does a 180 and they start upholding New Deal legislation as constitutional. In March 1937, there was a case before the Supreme Court that gets decided. There was a Washington state minimum wage law. Now, last year, 1936, by a vote of 5-4, the Supreme Court struck down a New York state minimum wage law. Now, in 1937, in a 5-4 vote, they uphold the Washington state minimum wage law. The justice that switched was Justin Owen Roberts. He shifted from the conservative side to the liberal side. So all of a sudden, a lot of New Deal legislation is going to be safe. Historians called this the switch in time that saved 9. Another thing that kind of helps is Justice Van Devanter. He announces he's going to retire from the court. So FDR is allowed to nominate someone to the Supreme Court. He nominates Alabama Senator Hugo Black. There's kind of a nasty confirmation fight because Black was a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, and FDR appoints him to be a Supreme Court justice. Eventually, FDR gets to put 8 people on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ends up saying the Wagner National Relations Act and the Social Security Act are constitutional. They're okay. So the Supreme Court ends up supporting the New Deal in the end. So basically, FDR lost the battle, but he won the war with the court. The Supreme Court's sudden reversal in 1937 has been called, the Constitutional Revolution of 1937. But FDR does spend a lot of his political capital. People start to oppose him and the New Deal at a higher level now. FDR does get some more legislation passed in 1937 and 1938. The Wagner-Stiegel National Housing Act in 1937. There's another AAA passed in 1938. There's something called the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. It kind of deals with minimum wage, maximum hours, and anti-child labor laws. So some things get passed in 1937 and 38, but for the most part, the New Deal starts to kind of die. FDR calls a special session of Congress in November of 1937. He lays out a bunch of things he wants, and Congress meets in November and December, and when they adjourn in December, not a single one of FDR's proposals gets enacted into law. So Congress kind of turns on FDR. In the final days of December 1937, a bipartisan group of lawmakers issued something called the Conservative Manifesto. Its main author was Senator Josiah Bailey. Basically, it kind of pushes back against the New Deal. It denounces the sit-down strikes as unconstitutional. They demand lower federal taxes and a balanced budget. It defends the doctrine of states' rights. It defends the right of private enterprise against government encroachment. It warns against the dangers of a permanent welfare class. David M. Kennedy in Freedom from Fear says that the Conservative Manifesto, quote, constituted a kind of founding charter for modern American conservatism. Now, because FDR starts to get opposed by a lot of his own Democrats, he decides to try to intervene in local Democratic races and primary some of his opponents. So there might be some senators that vote against the New Deal and they're Democrats, so FDR tries to get somebody to run against them and then oppose them in the general election. He had a fireside chat in June of 1938, and he said this: an election cannot give a country a firm sense of direction if it has 2 or more national parties which merely have different names but are as alike in their principal aims as peas in the same pod. So basically, FDR thinks, hey, there's some conservative people in the Democrat and the Republican Party. we need to kick all the conservatives out of the Democrat Party. That way there's a choice between a conservative and a liberal party. So FDR spends 1938 traveling around the country trying to drum up support for his preferred Democrat. But when election day comes, FDR failed completely to purge the Democrat Party of people he opposed. He also alienates a lot of people in his own party. The Republicans do well because of this. They win 13 governorships. They double their strength in the House. They pick up seats in the Senate. David Kennedy says, quote, "The election was a humiliating rebuke to the president and delivered a knockout punch to the New Deal." So kind of the last gasp of the New Deal could be the Roosevelt recession of 1937, 1938. Basically, the economy's been picking up somewhat, but all of a sudden, unemployment shoots back up, and unemployment is up again. The economy is down. This is another reason why the Republicans did well in 1938. But basically, you just have kind of a depression within a depression. Like I said, unemployment jumps up. It had been 14% in 1937, but then at the end of 1937, it jumps up to almost 20%. You still have 10 million people out of work. So this Roosevelt recession hurts the economy. There's lots of different explanations for why this recession happened. Some people said it was the normal rhythms of the business cycle. Others said it was due to FDR's anti-business policies. FDR had a theory that there was a capital strike. Basically, businessmen thought, let's not invest in the economy, let's not create new jobs, and we'll tank the economy, and we'll take Roosevelt down, we'll get him out of office. Some officials within the administration, they thought that FDR's attempt to balance the budget in 1937 caused the recession. They basically argued, look, from 1933 to 1937, you, FDR, spent more money than the government took in to prime the pump. You know, priming the pump is the idea that the government is supposed to put money into the economy during bad economic times, and then they'll spawn a recovery. So from 1933 to 37, this is what you did, FDR. But then in 1937, you pulled back some of that money and you decided to balance the budget and be more fiscally responsible. Well, that's when the recession hit. So a lot of FDR's own people believe that his kind of attempt to balance the budget did this. There's a lot of new ideas going around. John Maynard Keynes, he's an economist. He's kind of throwing around new ideas. His book in 1936, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, argued that it was the government's job to promote consumption. Keynes also believed that government needed to promote investment in the economy. That's kind of this idea of priming the pump. It's the government's job to encourage investment and consumption through deficit spending to spur the economy along. Now, some people thought you can spend all the money you want and it'll never work. FDR's Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, he said this, quote, "We have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. I saw after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot." Okay, so that's kind of the end of the New Deal. What did the New Deal do? According to David Kennedy in Freedom from Fear, it did not end the Great Depression. It did not provide economic recovery. Most historians believe that World War II did that. It did not substantially redistribute national income. It did not challenge the fundamental tenet of capitalism, the private ownership of the means of production. So he sees it as a moderate plan. It didn't go too radical of a direction. What did the New Deal do? He says it did this. It forever changed the landscape of America. Quote, into the 5 years of the New Deal was crowded more social and institutional change than into virtually any comparable compass of time in the nation's past. It provided security for vulnerable individuals. It provided security for capitalists, for consumers, for workers, employers, corporations, farmers, homeowners, bankers, and builders. It provided job security, life cycle security, financial security, market security. Quote, the New Deal's premier objective, at least until 1938, was not economic recovery but structural reform. In the last analysis, reform was the New Deal's lasting legacy. The New Deal's cardinal aim was not to destroy capitalism, but to devolatize it. So basically, make it so that when depressions happen, they're not as extreme as they previously were. David Kennedy believes that the New Deal played a role in post-war economic prosperity. So after World War II, the economy does really well, and he believes that's because a lot of the programs of the New Deal. The New Deal expanded the role of government. The federal government was now bigger and played a more direct role in the lives of its citizens. Calvin Coolidge once said that if the federal government shut down and went out of business, nobody would really notice. That idea is no longer true. The federal government is responsible for a lot. The federal government is now responsible for the well-being of the economy and is expected to intervene in economic downturns through such actions as priming the pump. The New Deal created and sustained a new political coalition, a coalition of northern immigrants, urban dwellers, industrial workers and labor unions, blacks, southern segregationists, Catholics and Jews. This political coalition will last into the 1970s and 80s. Some of it is still intact to this day. Other historians see it differently. In Jim Powell's FDR's Folly, he said that the New Deal created huge problems. It hurt the people it intended to help. It prolonged unemployment. Unemployment averaged 17% from 1933 to 1940. So the New Deal really didn't get rid of unemployment. It didn't get rid of the Depression. It just created a lot of government programs that didn't help. He has a list. He said FDR tripled taxes and hurt people that needed more money. FDR discouraged investors from investing in things that would fund growth and jobs. FDR made it more difficult and expensive to hire people. FDR made it hard for employers to raise capital. FDR destroyed food while millions were hungry. FDR made everything more expensive during the Depression. FDR broke up really strong banks. He went after banks that weren't really causing problems. Public work projects became a drag on the economy. FDR launched frivolous antitrust lawsuits. He targeted certain corporations. FDR channeled New Deal money away from the poorest people who lived in the South and sent it to states that were kind of swing states. Burton Folsom Jr. sees it kind of the same way. The New Deal did not get America out of the Great Depression. Unemployment stayed very high. The New Deal just created a lot of problems. So basically what ends up happening is the New Deal kind of dies in 1938. And as FDR later says, Dr. New Deal is replaced by Dr. Win the War. So World War II is on the horizon, and that's what's going to take up FDR's focus from now on.